All right, we're going to keep going on a similar theme. We've talked a little bit about overreaching, and next we have the pleasure of listening to Anaël Aubry from right here at INSEP. He's doing his PhD with Yann Lemire, and he's going to be giving his presentation on functional overreaching. Is it the key to peak performance during the taper? Over to you, Anaël.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan, for introducing my presentation. If you followed what Jenny was saying, on the article where I was mentioned, I will mention the training load during the weeks before, just before a performance, and during periods when we try to train as much as possible. And I would like to thank Jan and Christopher for their invitation, for their support for my thesis, but also Benjamin and Frank for their support. So if there is something which comes up again and again on conferences we've heard this morning, is that after all on triathlon, the high-level triathlon these days, if you want to progress, you must train intensively, because you reach the triathletes who are experts in their field, and the only way to create a psychological and physical stress is to put huge training loads. But you have to, of course, you know that there is a risk of fatigue. So the question here is, yes, but how far can we push? From what point are we going to turn over to the other side? Will be no adaptation but digression, and this is of course what every coach is afraid of. So the coach will always have to keep on balancing on this limit between the moment when the athlete has to progress. I want him of course to progress and reach up in the races, get high marks, but I don't want to get into something which might have a negative effect. So it's a balance. I have to if I train a lot, I get very tired, and if I overreach, I cannot work anymore. So that everything is very clear, I will define the various levels of fatigue that exist and stop on those which are really interesting for the high-level fatigue. Roman Mozan, who's the major specialist in fatigue, has a world consensus on this. He defines 6 levels of fatigue. The first 2 are not very interesting for the high-level elite. The first one is you have no sports activity, no fatigue, or maybe a slight psychological fatigue listening to me, but that's something else. Second level, we will all leave this conference and we'll go for a little footing, a little jogging, but tomorrow we will not be so tired that is going to reduce our performance. So these 2 levels of fatigue for the high-level performers is not interesting. We'll look at the next 4. I summed up quickly what Romain told us, and he defines the 4 levels of fatigue. So we have acute fatigue, functional overreaching, non-functional overreaching, and overtraining syndrome. The little red square or rectangle is what we can call a training camp, or a very heavy load. Starting from the idea that I have a group of athletes, we go to Formula for 3 weeks, and the idea is to have major sessions. On the first 2 levels of fatigue, there is the performance is bouncing back during the tapering period after the major training charge. So these 2 first levels are interesting as a coach, as an athlete, because what we want is to progress in terms of performance, of course, and progress in the classification. Then you see that the performance is being reduced, and it's not going to progress, it's going to go back to the baseline, or it's not just going back at all in the last case. So we are on 2 levels of fatigue which are absolutely of no interest. So in order to gain time, we'll just exclude them right away. So we will stop on the acute fatigue and functional overreaching, and I will define them a little more precisely. So the first level, acute fatigue. That's what did Romain told us. We have 3 weeks of training. We have a group of 10 athletes. 10 athletes, they go for 3 weeks in training camp. After the 3 weeks, they have 1 day off. when they will do nothing at all, or just a little bit of aerobic, but in order not to keep any residual fatigue linked to the fatigue due to the camp. And we, of course, tested them before the training period, and we test them again 2 or 3 days after, and we see there is no lowering in the performance. And if we are if we go into tapering for a few weeks, there will be a rebound, an increase of performance. So what will define this level of fatigue is that there's a high level of fatigue, which is quite logical. You went for 3 weeks with a very high intensive training. Performance is not reduced, and performance is increasing. Second level of interest to us, it's the functional overreaching. We have the same group, training, same charge, same load, but for some of them, when you test them, there's going to be a lowering of the performance at the end of the camp. It's very important to understand this difference between the first group, where the performance is not reduced, and the second group, where the performance is reduced. This reduction, if we put up a tapering session, it can be brought back, it can be overcompensated. So after all, when we look at both of them, after a while, there is no difference between the two levels. But here, there we still have a major fatigue. It's quite logical. It's linked to the overtraining. There's a reduction in performance and overcompensation. What Romain told us is that on all the studies made on the subject, we did not know until now what I'm going to tell you. We didn't know if there was a difference in this performance rebound. But the coach is going to go on this acute fatigue or functional overreaching without knowing which is best. So what I looked at the only 4 articles who looked into the question. The first one is Thomas and Busseau. They make a mathematical simulation from the data taken on athletes, and with the simulation, they produced dozens of tests. And this tells us that on the left, there is no overreaching, and on the right, there is overreaching. So it suggests that after a tapering period, as the 2 red lines, there will be an increase in performance. But this is done on 2 athletes and a mathematical model. It's not done on human beings. But we have 3 studies made on human beings. The first one by Aaron and Kutz. He's an Australian who worked on this subject. A study made on triathletes, 3 weeks of overload with overreaching. It was a lowering in performance that you can see. This is overcompensated through tapering. It's the little black dots. But it is compensated at the same level of the control group, the little white round. So there's no interest. But Aaron made only 1 test during the tapering, and literature suggests that the more tired you are, the longer it will be to recuperate. It did the same thing on rugbymen. This is an intermittent test giving us intermediate results. A last study done by Jan Christophe in 2013, which is the same kind of study as Aaron, lowering of performance compared to a control group. Here, the compensation is a little better than the control group, but again, we have only 1 period during the tapering. So it'll be interesting to see lowering what happens in tapering. The other points to be mentioned here is that it is always compared with control group, never with athletes who would have told us that they feel acute fatigue. So the objective of the study I'm going to show you is to explore whether there could be differences between the 2 levels of fatigue in terms of rebounding and performance during the tapering. So this is the detail of the study. We had 2 groups, just like for the groups I've mentioned, a control group and an overload training group. We put a maximum of people in the overload group in order to have the 2 levels of fatigue and to have enough people being studied in each group. The 2 groups would start the protocol in the same way, 3 weeks of training camp, 1 week of tapering, just to make sure that everybody was in top form. All participants were triathletes, amateur, but well-trained, 15 hours a week. So it's not very high level, but we are reaching the level of well-trained sportsmen. We have been doing this for several years, so we know that they can maintain the performance for a long time. So there's a first test with just aerobing on the bike. Then there will be differences between the two groups. The first group will do the same as usual. Then the other one will have an overload with 30% without changing the intensity or the frequency. We had put 30% not to say that you need 30%, simply because repeating the same studies over and over again, we know that this is the gap from which some athletes on the kind of population we were working on could have a negative effect of overloading, whereas others won't. So the post-test, I will explain later why it's so important. It's to see the level of the subject after the 3 weeks of training. Then the tapering for 1 month. Not to say that you need 1 month, but simply because, contrary to other studies we've seen before, in order to make a number of tests during this tapering period and to be certain to find a performance peak for all the athletes, triathletes. So it's important that everyone is very clear on this, because the whole what follows will depend on it. Or the test will make it possible to make the difference between those in acute fatigue and those who will be functionally overloaded. That is to say, if after the 3 weeks of overload with 1 day of recuperation during the post-test, if the performance did not go down, they were included in the acute fatigue group, and if they did, they would to the other group. So this will be a bit repetitious, but it has to be very clear. Our group was divided in two, and we were quite lucky. On the one hand, we had the acute fatigue, which would declare that they have felt intense fatigue, which was quite logical after 3 weeks of overload, and with performance which was roughly the same as before. On the other hand, those with a functional overreaching also felt a high fatigue, which is quite logical, a little more than the other group, but a decrease in the performance. So on the one hand, there are at least for whom there's no decrease of performance, and the others for whom there is decreased performance. So the control group is not going to change, whereas the overload group will be divided in two, with people with acute fatigue and functional overload on the other. When I say 5 out, simply because either they get they opted out for whatever reason. Then I will show you what happened in terms of performance. I will explain in order. Try to follow what I'm telling, because there will be a lot of information. So here you have on one hand the change of performance in relation to their post or their pre-test. On the other side, all the tests that were made during the protocol, the pre, the post, and the 4 tests during the tapering. And the small gray rectangle is a zone which could be called, if you leave the zone up or down, you could say that there was a change in performance. So to change the overloaded, functionally overloaded. Overreaching, sorry. On the post test, they have a decrease in performance, which is quite normal. That's why they're on this group. Then they rebound, they go over the gray zone. So this corresponds to what Romain was saying. Yes, they're going to recuperate and they're going to compensate. But something that should be clear immediately is that they didn't start any better than the control group, which did not do anything more than usual, knowing that these are, of course, average performance in the group, not the individual performance of each one. So very quickly we noticed that maybe it's not a good idea to overload, because it brings too much fatigue and a decrease in performance after the 3 weeks. But, and this but is very important, you can see that the acute fatigue, on the other hand, will have a very high increase of performance, over 4% after 2 weeks of tapering. It's an average, I insist. And 4% in sports science is a major increase. Then you could tell me, yes, but you were telling us that if they're extremely tired, it will take longer to recuperate. Others have said that each athlete is an individual, so the average performance, it's all very nice, but we should go and look at each individual to see what's happening. So on this graph, you will have the performance for each person in their best performance during the protocol. So here, okay, you have the performance in what? The three groups: control group, acute fatigue, and functional overreach. For each group, you have the pre-test, that is the test they've done before the training period, and the best performance during the protocol. Note that this best performance was always done during tapering, but we'll come back to this. And finally, this just confirms our result. That is, the acute fatigue group will have overcompensation, which will be twice as high as the functional overreach group, which will not compensate any better than the control group. So obviously, there is no interest to reach overreaching, functional overreaching. So a few messages from this. The first being that bringing major training charges for people who are already highly trained is essential. It's essential provided you don't go into functional overreaching. Then tapering is indispensable if you want to create this kind of process. All the subject and all the tests we've made, we had no performance peak outside of the tapering period. And also, those in functional overreach did not take longer to go back to their maximum performance. But be careful, some triathletes have had their performance peak during the first, the third, maybe even the fourth week. So this reaction in terms of performance during the tapering period is being confirmed in all the studies made then, but it's very individual. So it's worth trying with each one of your athletes what would be the best strategy in terms of tapering for each one of them. Then we will insist now on what means we can use to monitor this fatigue and avoid getting into overreaching. Something which would be easy to use in the field and that we don't need to go back to the lab to do a blood test, measure sleep, etc., etc. So I will stay on simple elements. Jamie's already mentioned them, and I will present them on our tests. So here, I got off the bike and I go back to an old study where we had maximum aerobic test running. I just use this test because it's simpler, and it's easier to understand the results. So again, a lot of info on this graph, which I explain. So the maximum aerobic, we have levels of 3 minutes at a given speed. So starting at 11 km per hour until the stop, and every 3 minutes there was a 1 minute pause without any effort, during which we would take lactate, for example. So every 4 minutes we increase the speed in terms of kilometer per hour. You have the heart rate for all the athletes during all the tests on the left. The results are then presented for the group of overload. On the little black dots you have the heart rate before, and on the gray dots the heart rate after, and which produced a decrease in performance. And you have, this is a scale going from 6 to 20 for a very easy effort to an extremely hard effort, and every time we would ask the triathlete to measure, to quote the difficulty of the effort. On the previous presentations, we could see that the exercises were quantified, and sometimes you had sessions which could be very easy, very difficult, and others very easy. So I'll try to give you information on the two types of sessions, because we will see things which are quite obvious with the overloaded people. On the extremely intense training sessions. What can we see on the VMA that will be used in the field? First thing, there is a decrease in performance. Roughly, they had lost one level. There are 3-minute levels. We can see this on the content of the triathletes on our studies. It's very easy to monitor on the intense sessions. You can do it on foot, on bike, even swimming. But it has to be standardized. If your triathlete, for example, usually does 10 times 400, you know at 1 or 2 seconds what is the time he can do according to its condition. But if it's overreached, their time just increased and kept increasing along the session. As you can see on this VMA, we have also a decrease in performance. So if you see that after one day off, you want to see where your athletes are, you're wondering what their fatigue level is, and they cannot maintain the intensity they usually do, there is a warning that should flash here. And maybe there should be some adaptation of the training load. Second thing, the maximum heart rate. Here you are going to reach very high heart rates, and here you can see that the heart rate has been reduced by 7 to 10 beats on a VA max test, which is not little. Now, what can we see on much more easy training sessions? First thing you can see, as for the maximum effort, you can see a major decrease of heart rate for the same intensity. So all the triathletes will tell you, okay, you start your running with such intensity. If you monitor regularly the athlete, you know how we will react in terms of heart rate. If you see that the heart rate is lower, it's a sign, which you have to put in conjunction with other signs I'm now going to show you. The second sign is the tapering heart rate. On a study recently published, we saw, and there were other articles before, that when athletes are functionally overreached, when there is this lowering in performance, the heart rate is increased during the recovery. The recovery heart rate is, in fact, when we did this on a PMA test, but when the triathletes would stop their PMA test at the end of the exercise, we would take the heart rate, the maximum heart rate at the end of the test, the heart rate after 1 minute of recovery during which they did nothing, and we looked at the difference between the two. But this heart rate was increased with the people who were functionally overreached. It was increased by 7 to 8 beats again. And this is interesting. This recovery heart rate is even more increased when they make a sub-maximum effort. On these results, for example, at 11 kilometers an hour, the functionally overreached had a heart rate increased by 16 beats, which is contrary to logic, because normally it's a sign of good form. If you recover quickly, your heartbeat, you're supposed to be in top form. But here, it reacts in the same way when you're overreached. So it's important to put this in relation with other indicators, such as the heart rate during effort, and what the athletes themselves feel concerning the difficulty of the effort. Why is it important to put this in relation? Because when you look at the control group, the recovery heart rate will also increase a little bit, 3-4 beats, not much. But it was due to the improvement. They could feel that the exercise was getting easier. On the other hand, on very low speeds, we could see that the functionally overreached could feel that the exercise on very low speeds was much more difficult than it used to be before the overreach period. So the message to retain from this. The first one is that, as I said before, yes, we'll have to train a lot to create this adaptation and to create well-adapted sportsmen. But this training planning will have to be adapted according to how the athlete is responding. And you should always stop at the right time and take a few days off rather than let him go deep into functional overreach. So you can monitor this through the performance and cardiac responses after a short rest period and after a hard training session. And what they tell you, we did this on the scales. We had very simple scales from 1 to 10 or 6 to 20, whatever. But even without a scale, the athletes know very well. They perceive the difficulty and the effort. If they perceive a running as very easy or very difficult, maybe there is a question. So, for example, you could put that in relation with what is the heart rate during the effort. So you don't have to go to intensive efforts, because you have seen before that heart rate is already lowered on the easy efforts, submaximal efforts. And a very simple indicator is the recovery heart rate. At the end of the running, you ask the athlete to stop, not to do anything, and you will measure the difference between immediately at the time he stops and 1 minute later. So it's very easy to do. You don't need to go to a lab to do this. And just before I stop, I'm showing some monitoring measures that can be made very easily. But in the lab, we discovered a few more things, which can be used in the field without any equipment. The first is the infections. On the study that we made, we have discovered, well, we didn't discover, it's just confirmed something that had long been known. When you go into overreaching, functional overreaching, people tend to fall sick much more easily. So if you see that infections are getting more and more frequent, maybe there's an alert there. Maybe there's a question concerning the training load. Maybe you should lift the weight a little bit. So there is a higher proportion of disease. Second thing is sleep. Sleep was monitored just simply with a watch. You can check the length of the sleep and the quality of sleep. On the top graph here, I think there are little triangles, black triangles. On the top one, you have the time during which the triathlete was sleeping. And you can see that this time spent sleeping is just decreasing for the functional overreached people. But they spend as much time in bed as before the period in the experiment. So they spent as much time in bed, but they didn't sleep as much. So, of course, they didn't recover as much. And on the bottom graph, you have the quality of their sleep. So they had a lot more wake faces in agitated sleep, so less sleep and lower quality sleep. And the triathletes, when they came back from 3 weeks of overreaching training, and we asked them how they did, they said, oh, I can feel, they would say it themselves, I can feel that I don't sleep well, I don't recover. So even without this difference, I'll be able to, you can listen to your athletes and see whether he says anything like this. I would like to thank Christopher and Ian for everything they did on this study. And Julien also worked with us a lot. He's not left us. And again, Frank and Benjamin and Cyril on the following studies. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Super. Fantastic presentation, Anaël. Some questions for Anaël.
Bo Berglund, Sweden. I have just a small question about mechanism. Do you have any idea about the mechanism, or have you studied them? I'm thinking of, for example, beta receptor sensitivity. Oh, sorry. Bo Berglund, Sweden. Have you an idea about the mechanisms behind your finding? Have you studied, for example, the beta receptor sensitivity in your different groups?
Well, I did not present them. I did not have the time. I just talked about what we can use during training. To answer your question, we measured the blood flow rate. This is a stress marker which talks about how the nervous system is involved and the extent to which it is. So the more you do this, you're sending more adrenaline into the body. And with those who are functionally overreaching, we saw that more they had to put adrenaline into their body, the less they actually did it. That's the first question. I don't know if, the first answer to the question. I don't know if that's enough in terms of answers.
As some certain nutritional supplements are making come downs for the nervous system. Basically, it won't affect any sleep, even if you are functionally overloading. So how it might affect, for example, if some certain of your recipients using some of them without any knowing that they are using this nutritional supplement, and it's not affected on your studies. So what's about that? So basically, you cannot monitor their adrenaline intake, since their parasympathetical and sympathetical neural system has come down non-naturally.
Ok. Alors, je suis pas sûr d'avoir tout compris.
I'm not sure that I've understood everything. First thing is that with regard to nutrition, we try to monitor things to ensure that there will not be any problems in this regard. We give them nutritional advice so that they're all on equal footing. So in our study, we didn't want nutrition to be another factor, so we tried to avoid these supplements. So this was with regard to the study, right? We did monitor this and try to be careful with this.
The participant had to reproduce exactly the same nutrition plan during the 2 days preceding each testing at the lab.
Super. I think we're going to leave it there. Can you please join me in thanking Anaël?